Let's now look at Nasserism and its problems, and in particular the problem of charismatic authority and expectations it creates. Let's go back for a moment and ask yourself, what is the purpose of government? Why do we have a state? What do you think? And not surprisingly, that's a question that has occupied political philosophers for a long time. And as you see on this slide, in the European tradition, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau each have developed different versions of a social contract theory, at the basis of which is always the primary problem of communal life. It's how to protect human being, both from external attack, but, and that's important, and that's something probably you might not immediately think about, protect him against each other. You know, as Hobbes famously said, you know, man is each other's wolf, homo homini lupus. So human beings want and need to live in community, but they need order and protection in order to do so. And that is the primary purpose of the state. So, according to, here's my old hero, Max Weber, according to him, the primary purpose of the state is to establish and maintain that order that is necessary for man to live the political, that is the communal life that he needs in order to, or she needs, in order to develop its full potential. So according to Weber, the necessary but not sufficient condition of a state is the physical ability to compel obedience to its orders, so to ensure order against resistance. So that's the quintessential necessary condition. But so he defines this power as any likelihood within a given social organization of carrying out one's will, even against resistance, irrespective of the foundation of that likelihood. So my old friend Max Weber defines the state in one of the most often quoted definitions in social sciences. And he defines a state in opposition to other social groupings that might be able to wield violence. So he defines the state as that entity, and now I quote, which successfully upholds the claim to the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of that order, end of quote. So simply because other groups can use violence, that does not make them legitimate. And that question of legitimacy is now the point of departure for his clarification of the definition, where he distinguishes between power and authority. Power is, as we described, just the physical ability to compel obedience against resistance. And it's a necessary condition. But it's not enough. And he says authority, Herrschaft, is the likelihood to find obedience for a certain order, even if no violence is used, and ideally if no violence is used. So authority requires the acceptance or submission of the subject into the legitimacy of the ruling structure. And Weber now creates a three-type ideal classification of how that authority can be, on what basis that authority can be established. And that's something that we will, it's an important analytical tool that allows us to distinguish different types of governments, particularly in the region that we look at here. So he says there's first the legal authority, which is based on some form of constitutional setup where rules are defined in advance, where authority is based on the abstractly defined position of the ruler, not on his person, and where relationships are contractual, more or less, and the authority is based on the subject matter competence and the meritocratic legitimization of the person exercising power. That's legal authority. The second type of authority, according to Weber, is traditional authority. It's based on the belief of the holiness of the social arrangements that have been inherited from previous periods. So the holiness and traditional character of order and authority systems, that's the characteristic of traditional authority. That's something that we will see very heavily, particularly in the Gulf states next week. It's a type of authority that is not necessarily based on meritocratic ideas or on competence. It's based on ideas of holiness, on tradition, on that's always been like this, so it's going to be like this forever. That's this kind of idea. So this is traditional authority. The third type of authority, something that is relevant for, particularly for Egypt, is what Weber calls charismatic authority. It's the idea that the ruler is endowed with some supernatural capacity or ability, often linked to some specific event, where the ruler has distinguished himself in a particular manner, or the way he can address populations. We saw this with Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, which is a clear example of charismatic authority. So he's the ability and the claim to followership of the ruler is based on his supernatural, extraordinary personal capacities, charismatic authority. And you can see that there's obviously, in a system that's based on charismatic authority, we have a problem with succession, because it's not always clear that the successor will have similar claim to charisma. Try to keep these three types of authority in mind: legal, rational authority, traditional authority, charismatic authority. All three of which are subsections of authority versus power. Try to keep this system in mind, and you can also read up on it a little bit. Now let's look at the states that are now entering the period of independence after colonial domination. They are now faced with the problem of establishing order or continuing a system of order that was primarily based on power. And they're now trying to create that authority in the Weberian sense, the belief of the ruled, the subjects, in the legitimacy of the order and their willing submission into following the orders of the state. And the states follow different patterns in this. Here we have a picture of Hassan II, which is the son of Mohammed V, who was the first post-independence king of Morocco. And that's an example of traditional authority. You know, they go back to their dynasty had been in power for a long time, even before the French came. They were subjugated by the French for a while, but they now continue. So their claim to power is primarily based on traditional authority. We have been here forever, we will be here forever, so continue to follow us. And it is a source of stability and continuity, particularly in the Moroccan case. We see that the attempt is made in other places. Here we have a picture of Idris on the left, the king of Libya, and I believe it's Fuad I of Egypt, who likewise tried to claim this traditional authority in their respective countries. But you remember what we discussed in the previous video, they are rulers whose position very, very strongly depends on the colonial power. So their claim to traditional authority is rather weak, particularly because both of them do not actually look back on a very long history of rule in their respective countries. You know, Fuad is a descendant of Muhammad Ali, who only came to power after their Napoleonic invasion, you remember. So there is a problem here. And there's a problem faced by all new states, how to establish order. And the ruling kings that have been often left by the colonial powers, or the presidential systems that were left by France, they are now facing a general problem of delegitimacy, and that is strongly reinforced by their defeat in 1948 against Israel. And in this void of legitimacy now comes the demagogic political charmeur, to use a French word. And here we see a picture of Nasser addressing crowds in, I believe it's in Damascus. And they are able, or movements like Nasser, are able to sweep aside these old traditional authorities with a relatively weak claim to traditional authority and replace it now with a charismatic claim to do it better than the others. Charismatic leadership thus could be seen as a shortcut to establishing legitimate authority when long-established traditional authority doesn't exist and capacities for creating rational legal authority are not existent or not yet existent. So Nasser, and to a much smaller degree Gaddafi and many others, enjoyed natural charisma, and they exploited that personal quality to create a psychological belief in their populations that they should entrust them with leading them towards a brighter future, something that the previous dynastic rulers had failed to do. So the basis of such order is ultimately psychological. And should the subjects lose their faith in the ruler, order will collapse and authority is lost. That fear for losing control combines with personality traits that are generally present in Arab societies, something that Al-Azm calls the clever personality, that combines to create a remarkable degree of resistance to criticism. And we will refer to Al-Azm's important book, Self-Criticism After Defeat, that I mentioned already. We will come back to this next week. It's one of the remarkable characteristics of many Arab societies is, and I believe it's linked to the reliance on charisma to establish political authority, is the refusal to look into policy mistakes and trying to address them. Let's now look at the problem of managing expectations that created by the charismatic leader. As I mentioned already, there is an inherent problem in any government system based on charismatic authority, is its inherent instability. What do you do when the ruler is no longer there? Or if something happens to him, either physically or if a big mistake happens. And the thorny question of succession is probably the best symbol of this, but succession is not the only iteration of this problem. Nasser now makes a number of bold claims to his population and actually beyond his borders. One is his claim to leadership in the non-aligned movement. So we said he relies on Soviet patronage, he takes their money, he takes their advisors, he takes their weapons, but he says, I'm not going to be part of that bloc, I'm going to be part of this third group, and I'm going to lead that third group. So he claims a leadership role in the non-aligned movement of the global south. At the same time, as we already mentioned, he claims a leadership role in in what he calls Arab unity, the need for Arab unity, pan-Arabism, he says. And the third closely related claim is he asserts a natural claim for leadership of Egypt in this, particularly in pan-Arabism, but also in the global non-aligned movement. Now, the problem with these claims is that they have to be based on some material basis, either military prowess, economic prowess, cultural prowess, or something. And so you already can imagine that there is a discrepancy between the claims, the expectations deliberately created, and the ability of state and society to deliver on the goods. So we already mentioned a number of videos back that following the Iranian lead with the oil nationalization in 1950, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal in 1956. He turns to the Soviets to finance his enlargement of the Aswan Dam. And in the ensuring Franco-British-Israeli attack, here we see British aircraft carriers at a time when Britain still had aircraft carriers. His army is only saved by utter annihilation through superpower involvement. So the political victory tremendously bolsters his charismatic appeal, not only in Egypt, but beyond Egypt. And it reinforces a psychological belief in the populations of Egypt, but also other Arab countries, of Nasser as a supernaturally endowed leader. And this psychological belief in his personal qualities masks the military and administrative failures of Egypt and the Egyptian state over which he presides. And that's an important thing to remember. The Egyptian army and the Egyptian state that creates this army is actually not that capable. Following his ideology of pan-Arabism, he says these colonially imposed borders are artificial, we need to transcend them, and it leads then actually to the creation of the United Arab Republic, which is an unprecedented and surprising fact of the unification of Egypt with Syria. Here we see Nasser with his cabinet, composed of both Egyptian and Syrian ministers. And it is deliberately created as the first step in the wider creation of a unified Arab Republic. So the idea is that other Arab states would join this united Arab Republic. And the main reason, he argues, that unity of the Arabs in one political community is necessary is to match and face the Israeli challenge that is seen as a colonial construct to keep the Arabs deliberately weak. Here we see Israeli troops in 1948 that have taken over Egyptian trenches. So ever since the Israeli victory in 1948, there's this thorn in the flesh of the Arabs. And Nasser claims now that the creation of the United Arab Republic will be the first step in unifying the Arab response to that challenge. And keep in mind that the previous monarchical rulers, they had failed to meet that challenge. After the supposed victory in 1956, and remember, it's only a political victory, it's not really a military victory, Nasser now aggressively attacks the legitimacy of the other Arab leaders, particularly those in the Gulf, and attacks their close relationship to the Western forces over which he had just prevailed in that conflict. And that attack on the legitimacy of Western-backed Arab leaders is epitomized in his intervention in the Yemeni civil war. Here we see an image from the Yemeni civil war, where Nasser supports the Republican left-leaning troops, both financially, militarily, and through actual deployment of troops. But the ultimate test of his challenge is obviously the liberation of Palestine. And that's something that he pursues through an ever closer alliance with the Soviet Union that now supplies him with very large amounts of weaponry. And the United Arab Republic, i.e. Egypt and Syria, now become the recipient of this largesse. And it's important that these weaponry delivered by the Soviet Union are essentially free. Egypt does not produce them. Egypt does not have to tax its population to come up with these wherewithal. And that explains perhaps how the adventurism that is inherent in that challenge could be pursued. And note for a moment that the supposed non-aligned position that Nasser had claimed in the movement is now compromised by this ever closer alliance with the Soviet Union, but never mind. And the more important thing is you need to remember the artificial nature of a foreign power bankrolling untrammeled ambition of a relatively minor southern power in its conflict. No question asked, whatever they ask for is delivered. That is an artificial, historically strange phenomenon, and it can only be explained in the particular idiosyncratic context of the Cold War. It's a situation that does not come again. So keep that in mind, and then that might explain the psychological deformities that develop now afterwards. Here we see the 1967 war, which here we have Israeli troops on the Golan, which they take from Syria. You all know that this war is an unmitigated disaster for Egypt and Syria and the other Arab countries that are involved. And Israeli superior tactics, training and strategy, more than its weaponry, because the weaponry itself is probably equal on both sides, prevail. And it's the failure of the Arab armies to actually make use of this modern weaponry is something that Al-Azm harshly criticizes in his book that I mentioned earlier on. And here we see the Israeli leaders, the Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, Moshe Dayan, and Uzi Nagis in the previously Jordanian-held part of the old city. They have now, unified Jerusalem, and the Arab armies have completely lost. So Nasser steps down, is humiliated, but he's, as you can see here, he's brought back by popular demand. And that shows the symbiosis that now exists between the population and the ruler. The population has come to rely on that psychological need and the supernatural abilities of their leaders, a charismatic claim to power, even when the claim to power has been clearly contradicted by practical events. So they bring him back to power, but he dies 3 years later. But it's important to remember now that these are not stage demonstrations. There's a genuine feeling of allegiance to him, because it's try to understand what I mean here with there's a symbiosis, the psychological symbiosis between the ruled and the ruler. They both want to believe in that charade there, these overambitious expectations that had been created. They don't want to let go of them in the face of a reality that is different. And it's not by coincidence that the book that I mentioned, Self-Criticism After Defeat, has been and continues to be prohibited in most Arab countries. And it's something that is not linked to Nasser and the personality of Nasser. It's a genuine popular need to hang on to that belief of superiority. The final point is, we mentioned the Yemeni civil war, and we already mentioned 2 videos back the now growing Arab Cold War, where the Gulf countries led by Saudi Arabia are now challenging that claim to authority by charismatic Egypt. And it's particularly Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent the other Gulf countries, that are now embarking, funded by very generous oil income that they have, on a very aggressive program of exporting religion, which is, as we will discover in next week, which is their main claim to authority domestically. So they now claim to export religion to other Muslim countries and their particular notion of Islam, the Wahhabi, particularly in the Saudi tradition, the Wahhabi notion of Islam. Here we see the King Faisal Mosque that the Saudis built in Islamabad in Pakistan. So we see now the beginnings of a very ambitious mosque building, madrasa building program by the Gulf countries. And this is the beginning of a very problematic discourse that is coming full circle in particularly in Afghanistan, when we talk about Afghanistan, where this extremely conservative, very narrow-minded, openly xenophobic notion of Islam that is now exported from the Gulf, initially aimed at Egypt, but ultimately aimed at the West in general, is creating negative externalities that are probably not envisaged by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf at this point when they start. Which then brings us to the topic of our next video, which is the problem of modernization and Islamism as a reaction to this as it plays out in North Africa.